Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Helga Sif, and I have the honor of sharing this forum that we are about to have for the next 1.5 hours. This forum is put together by 3 associations collaborating. It's Laufeyjar, Félag áhugafólks skaðminnkandi, Snarrótarinnar, and Rótarinnar. So we all came together to celebrate the publication of this great book in Icelandic. And I assume that you will all be giving this to everyone that you know for Christmas, right? And we are lucky to have Johann here himself. So we're going to talk today. Yesterday we talked in a different realm about substance use and decriminalization and the war on drugs. Today we're going to combine it in a little bit different way. So we're going to talk about harm reduction, drug use, and the war on drugs. I'm just going to do a brief introduction and then steer the discussion that goes on afterwards. I'm going to apologize. My apologies in advance. My English is a little bit rusty, so I might be hesitant.
It's so good.
Thank you.
It's so good.
So the reason for me being here is actually that I guess that I am one of the pioneers on harm reduction in Iceland. And yesterday I learned that storytelling is one of the most effective ways to get to people's hearts. That's what you taught me yesterday. Re-taught me actually. So I just wanted to tell you why on earth am I interested in harm reduction at all? And how has that kind of influenced everything that I do, both in the harm reduction program that I'm a part of, and then also in my professional life being a mental health nurse. So I am a mental health nurse, no surprise there. In my family, extended family, there are a lot of people with different mental health disorders and they use drugs. Some are alive, some are not. When I moved to, obviously I had to study more, so I went to the States, to Seattle in particular. And Seattle has the second largest homeless population in the US. And before I went there, I had been trained in the medical model of substance use and how to treat people who use drugs. I moved to Seattle and I discovered a whole nother world. I discovered harm reduction in Seattle. I got to be a volunteer in a program that is similar to Rótarinnar, a program that was a healthcare van, and we went out to the youth that were using mostly heroin. They defined themselves as runaway kids and throwaway kids, and we provided healthcare to them. That's where I fell in love with harm reduction and got to understand the importance of doing harm reduction, helping people to stay alive, to get better health. And on the notes that we were talking about yesterday, to actually be loved, kind of in that way. I moved back to Iceland in 2007. I also learned in the US the importance of volunteering. So I started volunteering for the Reykjavik Red Cross in the women's shelter. And I could not for the life of me understand why we were not implementing service based on harm reduction in Iceland at that time. In 2007, there was only our view of addiction around the medical model that we had imported from the US. So I started talking about harm reduction with the people who were running the shelter, and a lot of things came together in a fairly short period of time, maybe 3 months or something. We started planning and started the first needless change program in Iceland on October 10th, 2009. So it's 10 years now. It was 1 year from the financial collapse, if you remember. And so very optimistic doing this then. It was the needless change of Rótarinnar has always been developed based on Harm Reduction International's definition of what is harm reduction. And I just want to read to you the definition so that we're all on the same page about what it is. And Harm Reduction International states that harm reduction refers to policies, programs, and practices that aim to primarily reduce the adverse health, social, and economical consequences of use of legal and illegal psychoactive drugs without necessarily reducing drug consumption. So that has been the underpinning of everything that we do at the Red Cross regarding harm reduction. So some of you might know that the first few years we had a huge trailer and a jeep, so we dragged the trailer around. We weren't able to get close to people that we wanted to serve. And it definitely had the effect on how many people used our services. In the first 12 months of the program, only 65 individuals came to visit us. They made 144 visits. And we soon realized that we needed a different route, different method, and we needed different ways to get closer to the population. Because everything that we're reading in the research said that the closer that you can get to the actual, to people who need, the better service you can provide. So on February 21st, 2011, we finally went on our first shift on the former ambulance that we have now upgraded to a bigger van. And for me, it was remarkable. We've always emphasized in Rótarinnar to collect data, to try to understand what are we delivering, is it enough, and how can we improve. So the remaining 7 days of February, we got more visits on 7 days than we had gotten in the whole year. So to me, that speaks to the importance of getting service to people where they are at. So that's a really big thing for Rótarinnar. So there are all different of developmental waves that the program has gone through. For example, in 2014, we collaborated with one of the mobile phone companies in Iceland, and they gave us a mobile phone. And we started adding that to the service, that people could just call us and we can come to the place and deliver where they were at. And again, that had huge effect on the numbers of how many people wanted our services. In 2016, you might remember this, the health minister put together a committee that was supposed to look at and develop policy that was intended to reduce harm of psychoactive substance use. They put out a report in 2016 with 12 things for us to do. None of them have been executed. Some of them are currently in discussion. One being decriminalization. Second being safe injection sites. Third being collaboration between all the different services that provide service to people who are using, active users. That has not, it has not been put together. They also that we needed to treat hepatitis C and HIV. We needed to provide harm reduction into prisons. Should I go on? We should do research, active research in the population, and as far as I know, these suggestions still are to be executed. We haven't stopped developing our services in Rótarinnar. We, for example, put together, it's almost 2 years now, Steve, do you remember how long? We started the antibiotic program, so we collaborated with Landsbyggðalið. 3 years ago? Yeah.
February 2018.
Okay, thank you. So we've been running that for since then, with good results, and again we're collecting data so that we can understand the benefits for the service users as well as for society in the whole. We've also made sure that we have a consulting group of people that use drugs to help us develop the services. People who use drugs, the international, International Society of People Who Use Drugs. One of their main concern is that nothing about us without us, and we tried to work by that philosophy in Rótarinnar. So all of the different developmental steps that we take with the program are in collaboration with people who are using our services. And we are actually really proud of that. And we think that that might be the only service, one of the only services in Iceland that is actually doing that, to develop in collaboration. For me, I wish that Rótarinnar had been around when some of my relatives would have needed it. And I also wish that we didn't have the stigma that we have around people who use drugs. For example, one of my family members, he couldn't get on a transplant list for a new heart because he used substances. So, and he's not among us anymore. So I'm really excited about today that we can talk about harm reduction, decriminalization and stuff like that, so we're all on the same page and we can start to move forward. I know that we are developing stuff, but we need to do it faster and in a more concise way for the whole society. I didn't want to have an introduction longer for my part. I want to give you the main stage because I know that you have really important things to tell us. And then we'll open it up for discussion later on. So please write down all your questions, comments, and we will get to them. And I hope that I will have to stop you at 6 o'clock, not that we have silence until 6. Okay, are you ready? All right.
Great.
Yes,
Thank
right.
you so much. Thank you. Thanks very much. Your baby is very cute. As I was looking at your baby, I was thinking about, do you remember this moment? It's such an insane moment when, do you remember the rally where Donald Trump threw the baby out? Do you remember this? So there was Donald Trump spoke at a rally. I think it was just after he got elected. And it was a baby in the audience. It was, I'm sure, as cute as your baby. Your baby's probably a little bit cuter, but he threw the baby out. He told him to take it away. And someone pointed out afterwards that one of Donald Trump's most common insults for adults is he says, "You're a baby." And I thought, what a weird psychology way of calling someone like the idea of a baby is like your go-to insult. Where like we all really like babies. They're really cute. We love them. We were all babies once. So unlike Trump, I welcome your child to be here. So I've been thinking a lot about the amazing people who are doing work here on harm reduction in Iceland, who I've been meeting with. And one of the things I've been thinking about is, I think what's happening here in Iceland is a really powerful expression of a very deep tension that I've seen in lots of parts of the world. It's very hard to deliver harm reduction in a context of prohibition. And those two principles will inevitably conflict. So you think about the work that Snarrótarinnar is doing here, about a van providing, the Red Cross is doing here, providing services to people with addiction problems, so arguing for a supervised injection site. Everywhere in the world they've ever introduced a supervised injection site, deaths have really significantly fallen, literally everywhere. And what's happening is you've got people here pointing to that science, decent, good people, pointing out, we should copy all the places in the world that have saved lives doing this. And you've got the police who are also good and decent people who have been indoctrinated into this system of prohibition, who say, well, we'll stand outside the supervised injection site and we'll arrest people, right? That conflict is something that, that's particularly crude kind of conflict. That's very crude behavior by your police. But that conflict plays out everywhere where you have these two principles, harm reduction and prohibition. And when I think about harm reduction, the main thing I think about is a man called Alex Wodak and a group of people he worked with. And I just want to start by telling you the story of Alex and the people he worked with, because I think it really helps us to see the heart of this. So in 1984, Alex Wodak was a doctor in a place called King's Cross in Sydney in Australia. And King's Cross is a kind of, at that time, was a kind of rough neighbourhood, had a lot of prostitution, a lot of it was kind of gay neighbourhood, and it also had a lot of drug use, injecting drug use. And it was the first place in Australia where AIDS was noticed. People started getting very sick. They realised quite quickly that it was they figured out quickly it was a blood-borne disease, and so they knew what to do with gay men. They started distributing condoms, right? They knew about that. They started doing it very quickly, actually prevented very early prevented the spread, didn't prevent it entirely, but massively reduced the spread of HIV and AIDS through gay people in Australia. But, some of the older people here will remember, at this time there was a belief that a entirely understandable belief that these were the communities injecting drug users, gay men, prostitutes, sex workers, where the virus of HIV would arrive, but then it would spread to the wider population, which indeed was perfectly understandable and correct fear, because it did start to spread to the wider part of the population. So Alex was looking at these people who were dying, people who'd been working with as their doctor for years, drug users and gay men, and he was saying, okay, we're doing the right thing with gay people. What do we do with the injecting drug users? At this time, there were a few people at the same time who were starting to experiment. In Amsterdam, in Frankfurt, they had this idea, let's give out clean needles, right? Let's give them needles. Let's warn them, let's educate them about this disease, this virus. And at the time, Alex was one of the first people in the whole world to propose that. There was no scientific evidence for it. He just thought, as a doctor, and the response of the medical authorities was, this is ridiculous. They don't care about their lives, right? These are people who are just spending their time getting high. You can tell them all you like, they're still going to inject, they're still going to do it. It's not going to make a damn bit of difference. Also, the response of the medical authorities and the police was, even if you thought it worked, you can't do it. It's a crime. They had laws in Australia at the time around distributing drug paraphernalia. So like giving people things that meant they could use banned drugs. That was a crime. So Alex was told it wouldn't work even if you did it, and you can't do it, it's illegal. So Alex ganged up with a slightly unusual group of two groups of women. There were nuns, because they ran the local hospital, charity hospital for poor people in King's Cross. Nuns and prostitutes. He gathered them together in a group, and he said, let's work together, we'll start distributing needles. So a group of nuns and prostitutes, often together, went around King's Cross, saying to the local drug people with addiction problems, we're here to help, we're here to give you some needles. Some of the people who were shooting up thought they had begun to hallucinate. What's going on here? But anyway, they started doing it. They started educating the local injecting drug users about what HIV/AIDS was and how we could prevent its spread. Obviously, give people clean needles, they then dispose of them. Needle sharing was the norm at that time. In fact, needle sharing was particularly promoted at that time because the police would arrest anyone who they found with needles. So obviously that means you want to be carrying as few needles as possible. So if you're shooting up in a group, one person would bring the needle. It was actually a policy that unintentionally, it wasn't the intention, but it was a policy that effectively promoted needle sharing. So they started educating people and they started gathering very early scientific data. And Alex showed very early on it worked. It reduced the spread of HIV. And the police said, you've got to stop. Stop doing this or we will arrest you. You're promoting drug use, you're enabling drug use, you're making it possible for these people to do this disgusting thing. And Alex said to the police, but A, these people deserve to live, not die. They deserve to be treated with love and compassion. And secondly, even if you don't care about them, and you should, if we don't stop it here, it will spread to many more people in the population. And the police said, yeah, we're going to arrest you if you don't stop. It got to the point where the health minister for the country, called Alex in. There was news coverage of the nuns and prostitutes working together. Alex was called in by the health minister. There was a big meeting room, and there was the health minister, the public health advisor, and some other people. And they said to him, if you don't stop doing this, you're going to be arrested, you'll be put in prison, you'll lose your medical license. And Alex's father had been a survivor of the Holocaust. And Alex sat in that room and he thought about the people who stood up to defend persecuted people in Europe. His father survived because someone did that. He existed because of that. And he said to them, okay, if that's how it's going to be, arrest me, put me on trial. I will explain to a jury of 12 ordinary Australians why I'm doing this. You can put your case. We'll see who they side with. And Alex walked out. He got into the lift, the elevator, and the public health advisor, who'd been silent in the meeting, got in behind him and whispered to him, whatever you do, don't stop. They carried on distributing it. The police backed off. This established the principle, along with the people in Amsterdam and Frankfurt, that needle exchanges worked. They then spread to most of the world. That moment of courage on the part of those people in King's Cross saved the lives of, we'll never know how many people it saved, but I think a conservative estimate would be millions if you look at how many needle exchanges there are now all over the world. So when people are frightened and beaten back about needle exchanges or harm reduction, I always try to get them to think about that, and they don't need me to do this because they're already very brave, to think about that moment of courage that Alex Wodak showed. Alex, by the way, is now in his 70s, still at the forefront of fighting for drug reform. He's now the leader in Australia. They have a terrible number of deaths in Australia of people taking contaminated ecstasy at music festivals and dying. Every year, a really significant number of people die. He's at the absolute forefront in Australia of establishing, you can do it, the technology is very simple, just testing people's ecstasy before they take it. The same people who told him you can't do needle exchanges are telling him you can't do that, and he's still fighting, and he's doing it, right? And I think a lot about that. So you think about that conflict, right? What harm reduction has been are moments when brave and compassionate people have carved out a space within prohibition where we can make the police back off a bit and make the criminal authorities back off a bit. But it's a constant fight. So I'll give you another example of someone who really expanded our understanding of harm reduction in a way I think is totally compatible with what you're saying. So obviously I got to know Alex in Australia. In Vancouver, got to know an amazing pioneer of harm reduction, kind of legend in harm reduction. I think some of you have met Liz Evans. So Liz was initially, she was a nurse in emergency rooms in Vancouver, and so you get all kinds of people in the emergency room, but you disproportionately got, or rather she noticed, night after night, you got people with addiction problems who would come in, who would have an immediate crisis, hypothermia, some kind of poisoning, whatever it might be. They would kind of patch them up, and then they would just send them back out onto the street, and then they'd see them again a few days later, a week later, a month later. And Liz was looking at this and was like, this is crazy. Of course, we're just sending them out. We're setting them up to fail. Obviously, what these people need is housing, right? You're going to have a whole series of health disasters if you're living on the streets, right? They need housing. So Liz started to investigate this. She discovered that to get into public housing in Vancouver, in British Columbia, and basically the whole of Canada at the time, you had to be able to prove you didn't have an addiction problem, right? If they found out you had an addiction problem, you were thrown out of public housing. And Liz was, and made homeless. And Liz was like, but that's the exact opposite of what we should be doing, right? Who's going to stop their addiction problem when they're living under a bridge, right? I mean, you think about, I'm sure there's people in this room who've stopped smoking, right? Did you stop smoking the day that you were thrown out of your home and you found yourself living under a bridge? I doubt it. I think you probably stopped smoking when you were on a nice holiday somewhere, right? We all know with smoking, making people's lives worse will make their addiction worse. And yet somehow with other addictions, we forget that really basic principle and think, no, they need to be punished and shamed and driven into the dirt, and then they'll stop. So Liz had a really simple idea. There was a few people who were already working on this in Vancouver, but she was one of the real champions of it. She had this idea. The downtown east side of Vancouver is a very kind of poor neighborhood. It's the original Skid Row. That's where the phrase comes from. And there were loads of abandoned old hotels. It used to be where lots of people slept overnight when they cut down the trees and they would bring the trees into the port. But like that basically stopped. So there were loads of abandoned hotels. So with this group called the Portland Hotel Society, they started to just buy hotels and provide unconditional housing for the people who lived, people with addiction problems. They said, we're not going to tell you to stop using drugs. That's not our job. That's not our business. Whether or not you're using drugs, you deserve to have a home and a safe place to live, and people who love and value you and will sit with you and listen with you. That they said to people, our job is to walk with you, not to judge you and tell you what to do. So they started to provide this unconditional housing, and all kinds of people Liz started to get to know these people who'd had really tough lives. She started to begin to understand what had been happening to them. There was a woman, I'll call her Tilly, that's not her real name, she was, just to protect her identity, she was a First Nations person, so what in the US they call Native Americans, who've been treated horrendously in Canada. She had been taken away from her family as a child because they had this system of residential schools where they to kind of change the culture of First Nations people, they literally stole their children, kidnapped them, and sent them to these very brutal institutions where they were abused and beaten if they tried to speak their own language. It was terrible. Tilly had been through that. She'd been sexually abused. She'd never been treated with love and stability. And for the first time in her life, at the Portland Hotel Society, she had people who treated her decently. And she behaved difficultly a lot of the time. She would go out, she prostituted herself, and she would go with men who beat the shit out of her. And it was really hard for them to see that. She was reenacting the patterns of abuse that she'd seen throughout her life. And through building up this trust with her over many years, Tilly lived there for more than a decade, and not judging her and not telling her that they knew how she should live. They were able to begin to build some improvement in her life. She was able to contact the family she'd been taken away from, who she hadn't seen in decades. She went to visit them. It was hugely emotional for her. And Tilly never stopped using drugs. And she died when she was in her early 50s. And, I remember Liz saying to me once, in the old Portland Hotel Society building, from the perspective of conventional drug treatment, the story of Tilly is a failure, right? She never became abstinent. She never stopped using drugs. Liz said, for us, this is not a failure, right? She had a hard life, and she was loved, and we cared about her. And she died young, but she died knowing that she was valued, and that there were people here who supported her and didn't chase her out and didn't judge her. And one of the key principles that Liz has put forward, and she's done amazing work subsequently in New York, is, and all over the world actually, is this principle, which is, she argued, part of the problem we've had with harm reduction is that we've, against the will of the people who work in harm reduction, who don't see it this way, we've been forced to think about harm reduction too narrowly. So you think about where Alex Wodak started, right? Immediate harm is the HIV/AIDS crisis. Distribute needles massively reduces the harm. So you can see there, that's a narrow interpretation that's really, really important. And what was allowed within the system of prohibition was that narrow interpretation, right? But what Liz started to say, and harm reduction people all over the world have been saying, including here in Iceland, is, yeah, but what about the other harms? Homelessness is a harm, right? It's one of the biggest Someone said to me in a tunnel underneath Las Vegas a few months ago, you can't get through homelessness without drugs, right? You try being homeless for a week and not wanting to anaesthetize and drug yourself. You can't do it, right? For totally understandable reasons, which are not that those individuals have a brain disease, but that they're being treated appallingly, and in those circumstances, any of us would find anaesthetics much more appealing than we do at the moment. So Liz argued we need the currently existing infrastructure of harm reduction, needle exchanges, supervised injection sites. So you're still fighting for some of that first stage, but we also need a much deeper and more expansive understanding of what harm reduction is. A lot of the harm we are currently reducing with harm reduction is just the harm of the fact that the drugs are banned in the first place, right? Think about something like abscesses. A big part of what harm reduction work is, not a big part, a significant part, is just treating wounds, right? Like infected wounds or infections or wounds that are caused by the drug being contaminated by something else. You know where they don't have abscesses? In Switzerland, where heroin was legalized and they administer it in clinics. I don't mean they don't get them much. You never get them, right? Nobody gets abscesses. In Liverpool, in England, where they legalized, there's a doctor whose story I tell in the book, Dr. John Marks, who had been treating heroin addicts in other places like Wales, and they had abscesses all the time. He went to a place just outside Liverpool where heroin was legal. It's this little pocket of legalization that had survived in England, and was like, well, why doesn't anyone here have abscesses? What's going on? And he's like, well, oh right, that's the harm caused by the ban, because you transfer drugs to criminal gangs, which is what prohibition does. We can't do health and safety inspections of Pablo Escobar's lair, right? We can't check the quality of the product. And there's all sorts of other problems. So partly there's the harm caused by the drug war itself. Partly there's the harm just caused by a society that allows so many people to be treated so badly. And again, I've seen that conflict in so many places. So, and harm reduction in the context of prohibition is always dangerously fragile. I think about Sao Paulo, for example, where I went. So Liz did a lot of work. So Sao Paulo in Brazil, had an area that was known as Cracolândia, which gives you a sense of what it was like. Big concentration of people with very severe addiction problems. And the police were constantly coming in and beating the shit out of them. The official police mission was called Operation Pain and Suffering. That was literally what it was called. It's not subtle. It's like, I don't know if you've seen the comedy sketch, there's British comedians, Rob Webb and David Mitchell, who do a sketch where they're playing the Nazis. They're Nazi soldiers in the 1940s, and they're wearing the Nazi thing of logo like skull and crossbones. And one of them turns to them and goes, Fritz, I wonder. Sometimes I think, do you think we might be the bad guys? And I kind of think like, if your actual program is called Operation Pain and Suffering, you're probably the bad guys. So anyway, Liz went to Sao Paulo. They got a really great progressive mayor, and they learned all about what had happened in Vancouver. So giving people safe places to live is a good thing in and of itself, right? It doesn't need any justification beyond that. Every human being deserves a safe place to live. But it also led to a reduction in all sorts of problems. Not a magic bullet, but it led to reductions in chaotic street use. It was part of what led to the decline in overdose deaths, because people weren't hiding to shoot up, all sorts of reasons. So Sao Paulo was like, okay, we'll do that. The progressive mayor said, we're going to do this. So they bought a load of hotels in Sao Paulo. They did exactly what they did in Vancouver. It worked pretty well, and the police kept coming and beating the shit out of people. And not long after I was there, the police just literally demolished one of the hotels they bought, right? So again, you see, and now they've got this horrendous fascist, literally fascist governor of that state, part of the wider rise of fascism in Brazil under Jair Bolsonaro, and they've just demolished the whole thing. It's gone, and all those people are just abandoned again. So harm reduction in the context of prohibition always causes this tension. So there are lots of obstacles to harm reduction. The most obvious one is the drug war, right? And you can tell what I think about that. But there are more subtle obstacles to harm reduction that I think we need to think about. And there's one that is, I think, quite difficult to talk about, honestly. And it's not temperamentally what I like to do. I think a big part of our work in ending the drug war is about building coalitions and supporting each other and not looking for divisions among those of us who want to move to more compassionate policies. But I do think there's a tension we should talk about, which is and I want to stress it's some parts, not all of it by any means, some parts of what I think of as the institutionalized recovery movement object to harm reduction. So there are people who, so what I believe in is we need to have a really broad menu of options for people with addiction problems, right? For some of those people, 12 steps programs and residential rehab are absolutely the right thing. They've saved the lives of some of the people I love. They are not right for everyone. And it's not just that some people aren't ready for them yet. There are some people for whom it is not right. That's not the model that will help them. And I think we need to be adult enough to say different things work for different people. And it doesn't invalidate the people who've been helped, who deserve our congratulations, our love, our support, to point out it's not right for everyone. So I think you can get, and this tension came out in Vancouver. Dean Wilson, who was one of the people who really championed harm reduction in Vancouver, when they would say, but you should be promoting detox and rehab, not needle exchanges and heroin prescription, said, dead people don't detox, right? If we don't save people's lives, they'll never get to that option. But also, some people will never get there and still deserve love, like Tilly, right? Never got there. I was talking yesterday about Billie Holiday, the great jazz singer, resisted the people who tried to crush her and destroy her all her life for being an African American and for having an addiction problem. She never stopped, or never stopped for long. Still a hero. So I think, where does that come from? So some of it comes from all of it comes from decent people. And it comes from an entirely understandable place, which is people thinking, well, this helped me, so I want to give it to other people, right? But we don't do that with other things. We don't say, I've got a close friend who got cancer. I'm not saying addiction is like cancer, it's not, but she got a close friend who got cancer. She got a particular form of treatment that was quite unusual. She doesn't then go around to every other person with cancer and go, you've got to have this form of treatment or you're letting yourself down. We'd regard her as crazy if she did that, right? Because we see different people are different people have different needs. We need to respect those differences. I think there's also something going on that we need to talk about with a lot of compassion, which is in some parts of the recovery community, there's a lot of internalized stigma. When you are a group that is stigmatized, you can do one of two things. You can either fight the entire stigma, which is really hard, or you can accept the stigma and go, I used to be like that, but I'm not anymore, right? So the stigma is right, but I overcame the thing that you and I hate. And I see that, I'm gay, right? I see that in the gay community all the time. There's a lot of homophobia, fortunately a lot less than there used to be, but there's a lot of homophobia. And it's very tempting to kind of accept the homophobic stereotype and go, yeah, but I'm not the faggot, right? Oh, I don't like these effeminate gays, right? You can see how that happens, right? Or you can see it with African Americans who kind of define themselves against the negative stereotype of African Americans. You can understand where that comes from. But I don't think it's ultimately healthy. So you see that in a lot of the language some of the language that emerges in the recovery community. So criticizing anyone saying that people are enabling if they, don't throw someone out. Saying someone is codependent if they want to remain in a loving relationship with someone who's got an addiction problem. Or even the concept of rock bottom, right? Things have got to get really bad for you before you get better. Well, that's just not true. We don't say that to smokers. Wait till you've got emphysema, then you'll figure it out, right? We don't say that. We say actually at any point, at every point you deserve love and support. And at every point you deserve the best options. And to say just go away and come back when you're nearly dead is well, because for a lot of people they don't come back because they do in fact die. So I think we need to challenge some of these problematic ideas, which is not to say we should challenge the legitimacy of the 12 steps model for some people, right? I'm passionately in favour of it for some people. I recommend it for some people. But we need to be honest about the ways in which it doesn't work for other people and the ways in which this terrible stigma, this unjust, terrible stigma, can be internalized by people. And the best way to respond to that is not to angrily denounce them, is to love them and to help them see where that's coming from inside them. It's also important to see, and again, it's a difficult thing to talk about, and it's a difference with some parts of the recovery community, not all. We've got to be honest about, I think all the time about this quote from, Marianne Faithfull, the British rock star. It's really annoying. She's most remembered because she was Mick Jagger's girlfriend, but she's much better than Mick Jagger, I think. I once met Mick Jagger and told him that, and he looked really pissed off. But so she wrote this. She had a heroin addiction in the 60s, and she became homeless. It was a terrible time for her. She has this line in her autobiography, her memoir. It's really challenging. I don't usually quote this in public, actually, because it's quite challenging. She said, "Heroin saved my life, because if it wasn't for heroin, I would have killed myself at that point." Right? Now, Marianne Faithfull is not saying heroin is a good solution to despair, right? Obviously. What she's saying is we need to, as I understand it, we need to understand the context in which drug use happens, and that most of the time, I would say all of the time actually, in the context of addiction as opposed to recreational use, addiction is an attempt to solve an underlying problem. It is a symptom of the problem. It's not the problem itself. Now, it's a symptom that can make the problem a lot worse, obviously, in ways that I don't need to explain to you because they're so obvious. But I think we need to think about the deeper problem. And I think this thing about pathology or becoming obsessed with getting rid of the symptom, in some circumstances doesn't help. Because actually, very often what happens is if you persuade someone to give up their drug and then send them back into the environment where they were horrifically depressed, disturbed, traumatized, homeless, whatever is going on, actually they're facing this agony with no anesthetics. What you need to do is simultaneously, we need to change the environment, and that will make them less dependent upon these anesthetics. For some people, not for everyone. Someone like Tilly never stopped. Someone like Billie Holiday never stopped. And I saw in a lot of places how this becomes possible when you end the system of prohibition, right? So think about Portugal, where I spent a lot of time. They had harm reduction services before they decriminalised all drugs. They did good and valuable work. But I remember going out with the harm reduction workers in Lisbon after the decriminalisation, and there just being such a change. The difference between going for help to the state when you are not a criminal is so different to going to the state for help when you're admitting to a crime, right? Crime for which you can be severely punished. So it's so important that your committee on harm reduction stress the most important thing you can do is decriminalise, because that opens up the whole. Firstly, it prevents a huge amount of harm in and of itself. They're not being fined, they're not having their drugs taken away by the police, all those they're not being shamed and told by the society you are criminals. So that just immediately it reduces a certain amount of harm, and then it creates a space in which they can be given much more extensive visions of harm reduction. And it saves so much money that you can begin to actually give them some damn help, right? That conflict will continue to happen in the context of prohibition. I saw it in Britain, my own country. David Cameron, you might remember him, Prime Minister who destroyed Britain. I hate him so much. David Cameron, when he came, so we had quite well-established harm reduction services in Britain. And David Cameron came in, led by this appalling minister called Ian Duncan Smith, who I once had to go on a panel with. It was awful. just said, oh, well, we'll turn all the harm reduction services, really tried to stoke this division between harm reduction and recovery. And said, well, why are we giving all this money to maintain people using drugs? We'll just move all of that money into recovery. And when they tried to do it, it was a disaster. Not to say that funding recovery services is not really worth doing, but stoking that, because it absolutely is, but stoking that division. So I think when it comes to the debate about harm reduction, just as a last thought, I would say, fight for it every step of the way. Everywhere harm reduction services have been tried, they have saved lives. And know that under a system of prohibition, you can take that so far and you will bump into a wall. You'll bump into forces of resistance, and then you need to begin to dismantle the wall. So there's no opposition to harm reduction and moving beyond the drug war. You build as much space for harm reduction as you can under this system, and then dismantle the system. Yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you so much.
Hooray, thank you.
Okay, now we'll open it up for comments and questions. So go wild. First one.
I'm so deaf. Do you mind standing up? It's so wrong with my hearing in Iceland. I don't know why. Yeah. I felt my ears haven't popped and played. Good.
Oftentimes people who seek drugs, are people who are disenfranchised in many ways. Do you see a way in which economic policies, like universal basic income, for example, could alleviate that disenfranchisement?
Yeah.
Move people from drug dependence?
Yeah. So this is I love this question. I wrote about this in my other book, which is not in Icelandic yet, but halda, you can do that one as well. So this is not a hypothetical question. Interestingly, it was tried. So in Canada in the 1970s, the Canadian government decided that they chose a town genuinely at random, which I think is so interesting. They literally did it randomly. They chose a town called Dauphin in Manitoba to do an experiment. But they're like, okay, because there were they had a welfare state, but there was still a lot of insecurity and holes in the welfare state. So they said to a huge number of people in this town, from now on, we're going to give you a guaranteed basic income. There's nothing you have to do in return for it. And there's nothing you can do that means we'll take it away unless you go to prison, right? And they just wanted to see what would happen. They were just like, you're citizens of our country. We want you to have a good life. Let's see what happens. And it wasn't a huge amount of money. It was like equivalent to about 12,000 American dollars, right? So you're not going to be homeless if you've got $12,000, but you're not going to have a great life, right? And loads of things happened. So nobody gave up work, which I think is interesting. People carried on working, almost literally nobody. There were some people studied longer, so some people remained in university longer, which was the only kind of not working thing. And some people held out for better jobs, so job conditions improved because you didn't have to take the next job that came along. But the biggest thing that happened, that I think is really relevant to your question, is massive fall in all forms of mental health problems, right? People who were mental health problems that were so severe, people had to be shut away in psychiatric hospitals, massively fell. And in a way, when you explain the reason, it's kind of, I interviewed this one called Dr. Evelyn Forget, who's the kind of leading expert. When you hear the explanation for why, it's kind of like, no shit, Sherlock, right? Turns out financial insecurity makes people feel like shit. Giving them financial security makes them feel better. And if you feel better, you're less likely to have an addiction problem, right? So, yeah, I think you're totally right that you think about addiction, and this thing that's really worth thinking about here in Iceland, where you have unusually high levels of overdose deaths here, right? Addiction crises are always symptoms of a deeper problem. Think about the United States at the moment. They've got this big opioid crisis in the US, right? Where is the opioid crisis happening? It's happening in the places where suicide is highest, where antidepressant use is highest, where support for Trump is highest. And I don't think that's a joke. Like it's, where people are loneliest. There's a team of British academics called Sir Angus Dayton and Professor Anne Case, who've been studying this, and they call them deaths of despair, the deaths of the opioid crisis, right? So addiction crises are always symptoms of something deeper. You can see this throughout history. Japan has a massive addiction crisis from 1946 to 1951. What happened in Japan? Oh yeah, they got nuked and their country was destroyed and they were in ruins and everything they believed in was discredited. And unsurprisingly, they started to find meth much more appealing than they had in 1933, right? You see these addiction crises that they track with wider pockets of despair. So I don't know enough about Iceland to tell you what's the despair that's making so many people here overdose. I just don't know. You all have a much better insight onto that than me, but I think you're totally right. In a way, drug policy, it's really, really important to talk about drug policy. And you can save a huge amount of people's lives just by changing drug policy. But actually, if you want to really reduce addiction deaths, you've also got to talk about, if you want to understand why people are taking painkillers, you've got to understand why they're in pain. And you've got to deal with the pain. Yeah. Thank you. Hi.
So just a follow-up question. My name is Halda. Just a follow-up question on what you were talking about regarding opioid crisis and legal drug people who are addicted to legal drugs. In what way? Yeah. Can you talk about in what way changing drug legislation in regards to illegal drugs? In what way can that make an impact on people who are dealing with addiction to currently legal drugs?
Prescription drugs.
Sorry?
Prescription drugs. Right.
Yeah. So it's really interesting. I'm really interested. I'm going to ask you about something in a second because I want to know if this is the case in Iceland. But it's really interesting. So sometimes people look at the opioid crisis in the US and they go, well, this is an example of legalization, right? You have these legal prescription drugs and loads of people become addicted and it's a disaster. It's not what happened in the US at all. You look at what actually happened. Say that I'm a doctor and you're my patient and I start giving you OxyContin, or another opioid-based painkiller. About 3 to 7% of people given them become addicted, right? And they're the people who've got these deeper problems. But set that aside for a second. If, as an American doctor, if I find out that you are taking this not because you've got a bad back or bad knees or whatever, but because you're addicted, I have to stop giving you the drug at that point. Otherwise, I can go to prison as a drug dealer, and that's happened to a lot of doctors, right? So the point of apart from there being prescription for addiction, that is a crime, right? I mean, people go to prison. Is that the case in Iceland? Does that happen here?
No.
Okay, that's interesting.
They get scolded by the Surgeon General.
right. So that's interesting. In terms of legal drugs, I think you have to look at the Swiss example, right? So Switzerland had this big opioid crisis, and they ended it. And how did they do it? It was led by a woman we love, Ruth Dreifuss, who's the first female president, totally incredible human being. So they had this huge opioid crisis. They shamed and punished people for years. It was a complete car crash. It got worse and worse. And then Ruth Dreifuss became the Minister for Health and then the president. And she really listened to the groups that were arguing for change. And they introduced a system of legalized heroin. So the way it works is, I talked about this a bit yesterday, so I apologise for the people who already know this. But if you've got heroin addiction, you're assigned to a clinic. You go to that clinic. You're given the drug there. You can't take it out with you because they don't want you to sell it on. And also because they want to watch you while you use it, make sure you're okay. And then you leave to go to your job because you get loads of support to get housing, psychological support, subsidised work. And again, so that's a system of two things. Prescription plus massive amounts of social support, right? To deal with the underlying pain. It really connects with what you were asking. And one thing that really surprised me in that system is I remember going to the clinic in Geneva where they do this, and the psychiatrist who runs it is a woman called Dr. Rita Mangi. And she said to me, if you're part of that program, we give you any dose you want except for one that would literally kill you. And there's never any pressure to cut back. You can stay on that program your whole life if you want to. And yet, I was there like 12 years after it had started, and there was almost nobody who was still on the program then who had been on the program at the start. There were like 3 people. Almost everyone cut back over time and stopped. And I said to her, well, I don't get that. Why is that? Presumably, we're told the drug takes you over, you need more and more of it. If you were given a free, infinite supply, why would you stop? And she looked at me like I was stupid, and she said, well, we help them. And their lives get better. And as your life gets better, you don't want to be drugged so much, right? And I was like, oh, shit. So again, I would say the prescription model is, and this is, so because they had the wrong story in the US, which is the evil drugs took everyone over, they turned to the wrong solution, which is they threw people off the drug, right? And what happens? I interviewed a doctor in Oklahoma, Dr. Hal Voss, he's quoted in the book, who just said, well, what happens is they either kill themselves because the agony resumes, or they go and buy street heroin, which is much worse. It's a disaster. The places where they've done this, it hasn't worked. So the Swiss model is give the drug they're addicted to and give massive amounts of support so they won't, over time, want so much of the drug. That's the model for prescription, I think. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, fine.
Do you want me to stand up?
If that's okay, yeah,
Yes,
thanks.
of course. So, hey, my name is Elisabeth. I'm a nurse of hverju. I just got hired in December last year, and I've been developing like the healthcare service with hverju and HIV and Hep C tests and everything.
Amazing.
It's amazing. I love it, and I've learned so much just from like these 40 minutes, and it has really like touched me because we've been dealing with a lot regarding with the police and everything. But so it's really great to talk to people who have been dealing with the same thing. But what I wanted to maybe discuss a little bit is the healthcare system, because what a part of my job is to support our clients into seeking help. So I work as a nurse on site, but when they need more help, I support them by following them to a doctor or like to the emergency room. And what I've been experiencing a lot is that they are denied healthcare because they're under influence or they are using drugs, etc. It's put delicately, it's said like they use certain kind of terms, like we can't evaluate you because you're under influence, etc. And maybe that is something that they can't do, but it's my belief that you should receive like health service no matter what your condition is. So what I'm thinking now as a nurse who evaluates patients on site every day, I have no problem with it. Do you think like the war on drugs is affecting the healthcare system as well? Or that's.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's a comment or a question.
Yeah, no, that's so.
It's just a thought. I'm
Totally.
thinking constantly about this because they're denied entry into the healthcare system because they're under influence, and I think it's a violation of their rights. But yeah.
Totally, you should be so proud of what you're doing. And I think, I've seen that in so many places. One of the most I actually didn't write about it in the book, but one of the most shocking experiences I had. I was in Washington DC, so the capital of the richest country ever. And I was with this amazing nurse called Billy Tyler. We were going on her round. So she was just doing it volunteer. Her son had died of an overdose. So she would go and just do voluntary work with people who had addiction problems and go to their houses and give them. And there was one place we went where it was insane. It was a house where you could see the Senate building from this house, right? And the people who were there who had addiction problems, they were treated like such shit in the hospitals that they just would never go. And these are people who, they had like necrotic tissue in their wounds. And they had literally, the way they were trying to treat it was they had got maggots out the garbage and put it into the necrotic, because the maggots will eat necrotic tissue. And I was like, this is what the war on drugs has done to people, that those nurses it's so poisoned something as basic as like medical care, right? Literally it's made these nurses and doctors breach the Hippocratic Oath and turn away people and make them feel so bad that in the capital of the richest country in the world have resorted to putting maggots in their wounds because they think that'll be the best option they've got, right? So I think you're totally right. And I think, and you mentioned the police as well. I think a big part of this is that is, you know, as pure an expression of stigma as you can imagine, right? Is there any other group in this society where a nurse would say, I'm not going to treat you? I can't imagine one, right? You know, I'm thinking that in Britain at a time when, when we had a lot of IRA bombs, there was a lot in Britain when you know, an IRA person was shot or something, they would always be given medical care, and sometimes you'd have these right-wingers going, why are we doing this? But while we gave medical care rightly to kind of IRA terrorists, they would routinely turn addicts away from hospitals. I was like, wow, you know, we'll do it with people who are trying to kill us, but not with people who have addiction problems, right? And of course, I think we should give them to both. I'm not saying we shouldn't give them to IRA, so I think you're totally right, and I think that is where I think, in a way, aggressively challenging those people doesn't work. It'll just make them double down. I think just asking, is there any other group that you would turn away at this point? Or even just, can you present me with any medical evidence that demonstrates that a person who's under the influence of drugs can't describe pain or their medical condition? But I think more importantly, it's about storytelling. And I wonder if there are ways you can just bring people with addiction problems in to meet nurses, talk about their lives, and talk about a time they were denied medical care. I think that there's all this evidence about how people change their minds, and it's overwhelmingly stories, connection, empathy, kindness. It's not angrily arguing with someone, which is a shame because our whole culture now spends its time angrily arguing with people. But which is why we're hardening and not changing, I think. So I think you're totally right, and I think that there are ways of doing that. And I think, you know, can as you know, I wonder, as part of nurses training, could you bring someone with an addiction problem in to talk to them and talk about their lives and talk about why they had an addiction problem? Because if the nurses think, oh, this person just partied too hard and indulged themselves and that's why they're standing here in front of me, that's very different to, oh, this person was sexually abused or whatever was going on there, right? So I think you're totally right to want to do that. And the one thing I would say is these things can change quite quickly, you know. The main thing I take from being gay is just how much better the world can get so quickly. I think about you literally had 2,000 years of gay people being like persecuted, burned, like really horrific things. And basically, thanks to amazing people in the generation before mine, mostly, think about how quickly that fell, right? I just recently read this wonderful Icelandic novel, Moonstone, by Sjön, is that how you say it? Sjön. So I can't say any Icelandic words. Which is about like a gay Icelandic kid in Iceland in 1918 who was forced into exile, right? You can imagine showing those people this country now, right? That scale of that transformation. So these things can totally change really quickly. Things that were totally normal to say about gay people when I was a kid are unthinkable now, right? Even your nastiest right-wing politician would have to resign if they said things that were quite normal to say 20 years ago, right? So I think, bear in mind, those things can change very quickly. They change when you appeal to people's kind of love and empathy and compassion.
2 questions.
This is a cultural thing where you're meant to defer. Sorry, okay, go on. Okay. Hi. Oh, great. Sorry.
And I'm a sociologist, and I think harm reduction is a beautiful thing. I'm so happy, and we are talking so much about it, and I want to take it further than just we're thinking about it just for people which are injecting, but people which are addicted have lots of problems, although they're not injecting. I have many in my family and also in my friend's family, and there are a lot of problems. And one of the big problems is that people are told to isolate the addicted person, and then everything will be fine. Oh, I feel so much better when my son is out, or my daughter is there. And that's why I think we need to take it so much further, because we need to help these people, because they are so
Marginalized.
stigmatized or something. That's why we need to do so much more. It's not enough to have home, they have to have some place to go or some people to meet, and we need to talk to them. And
because they are really isolated. And I have so many stories about the healthcare system, and they are not. They have been. I have one relative. He was going to the dentist in the university. What do you call it? Where the students are, and they can get free.
Tanngarður.
Okay. He went there, and they asked him why his teeth are like that. He said, maybe I use too much cannabis. He's autism and also a cannabis addict. And he was thrown out without helping him. And he still
This
has
is
it
all over the health system.
Yeah, and he has been many times in the mental hospital and didn't get out with his teeth, and he has a real pain. And one time he fell in the street or somewhere and hurt himself a lot. He couldn't walk. And he asked the neighbor to call ambulance, but the police came and threw him in jail. And I picked him up the day after he couldn't walk. I had to carry him into the car at the hospital. So there are so many stories that we have to educate the police and healthcare system and everyone about these things because it's so big problem.
Wow,
Probably
that's
the main
shocking.
problem. The stigma element in it all.
Yeah.
And everywhere in the healthcare system, you're thrown out. Even if you just went for a clinic 20 years ago. There is famous story of Þórir Tyrfingsson. He got into car accident. I'm sorry for just taking the word. I just get hot. And Þórir Tyrfingsson got into car accident. He runs SOR and is the main man behind this theory. Throw your kids out if they are in trouble. Don't talk to them. You know, close all doors on them so they can feel how bad it is. And this is very, very bad thing. And Þórir got into a car accident. He needed to go into a surgery, and because he was famous for being a therapist, he needed to cry for pain medicines, and they decided to trust him because he was running the drug therapy SOR. So they trusted him, but if he would have been normal citizen, probably not get proper medicine before the surgery. And this story is, I got into accident a few years ago and I've been using cannabis and I've been throwing out everywhere. It's so hard to be, you know, something happened and you need the system to help you and you're thrown out everywhere.
It's so insane because what's the underlying principle that if you smoke cannabis you don't deserve teeth? Or like what are they talking about? Like
this?
Paying all the day, week after week and month after month because he didn't get help.
that is surely a breach of the that's surely a breach of the Hippocratic Oath, right? You're not allowed to take. Is it not? I just don't know enough about it.
Also with people on blood pressure with no service.
Huh.
It's the prohibition.
Shocking. It's absolutely shocking.
It is,
Yeah. Oh. Hi.
I maybe not.
Oh, sorry, I can't really hear you. I'm so sorry.
I am going to try to follow this. I was just wanting to ask about whether you know, either of you, or maybe someone from Rótarinnar, if you know of any harm reduction programs or projects that involve some kind of feminist approach or intersectionality, because I read a really interesting paper the other day about how needle exchange programs and outreach programs were not really reaching, or they were reaching women, but the result was not reaching women. It was research from San Francisco with hepatitis C, yeah, exactly. And because there's so much gender violence, and the men were often just kind of taking control over the injections and over how to inject, over the dealers, to reach the people who were feeling, and also then they would inject themselves first and then help the women inject themselves and maybe not exchange the needles, or because they couldn't be bothered, or just there was many dimensions of or layers of violence there before. So the result was that women who were using drugs or injecting drugs would much rather get infected or whatever.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if you heard of any programs that take this gender dimension and violence into account in harm reduction. Right. Yeah.
Þú svo segja það?
I feel like you, literally the expert is in the room. So,
I don't know of many such programs, but I would look to Canada. Yeah. They have in British Columbia and Edmonton. There is they have a great service and approach, and in Vancouver.
In Vancouver, yeah.
I mean, this area, I think you will find the best practice there in this this regard. From what I know, Australia maybe.
Yeah, also in Spain, they have a really cool women program there. I can show you. I don't remember the name.
there's two. Oh, sorry.
No, I was just going to say in Fyrirlestur we've actually we have data to support what you were talking about, because once we started with a mobile phone, because we were just a man going around, and the main population getting services was men. Once we got the phone, it was much easier for women to contact us. They could just call, and we could meet them where they wanted at that time that they wanted, and in secrecy, whatever. So for the first few months using the phone, it was actually increase in women getting services. It's leveled out a bit, but I know that we do our very best to work from a gender perspective and think about how can we help in situations that might be harmful.
We have a Facebook site that you can also send messages, and we are aware of some women come to the car and they're getting phone calls saying, where are you, and of course everyone who comes to the car, we don't share information to other people. We have men bringing us to ask if they've come to the car, and we never share that, and we don't text them or call them we don't call them if they don't want us to call them to follow through with anything, if someone is monitoring the phone or something. So we're really aware of this in Fyrirlestur, at least, and try to make up a plan with the woman, so we can reach her and she can be on her own in the car with us at least.
It's kind of a safety plan. I know that the women's shelter they do a really big deal of that as well. So try to have security and then a agreement. How do you want us to help us in this situation, and try to have that conversation with the women that seek services there. But it's really difficult, especially in a small population like this. Everyone knows everyone, so you have to be. Well, it's a fine line that you have to track, but definitely trying to start the conversation in a safe place is the first step, and hopefully we're doing a little bit of it, but definitely need to figure out ways to do it better.
Yeah, there's two. I was thinking about that. There's two gender aspects of drug war. I should have thought about this more, but there's two aspects I think are really interesting to look at. Just off the top of my head, which one is, so you know this thing I do, drug mules. So women who are made to swallow drugs and transport. It's often women from the Caribbean. So drug mules are massively disproportionately women, and what happens to them is awful. So a lot of Caribbean women are caught smuggling these drugs into the United States. They get these incredibly long prison sentences in the US, and then they're sent back to Jamaica or whatever, and they have to do another prison sentence in Jamaica. So these women get and often these are women who are intimidated into doing it, even if they're not intimidated, I think it's insane punishment. But often these are women who are intimidated into doing it. So that's an interesting gender dynamic. I also think one of the other gender things that isn't talked about enough is in Switzerland, when they legalized heroin, street prostitution literally ended in Switzerland, right? Ended. Many years later, there was some kind of Eastern European trafficking so it resumed a little bit. But which I think should be a bigger part of the prostitution debate, right? This is not true of all prostitution by any means, or sex work, or whatever you want to call it. But it turns out women don't want to have random sex with disgusting strangers on the street if you give them help with their addiction, right? Which again shouldn't have been very. And I'm not saying that's all prostitution; it's not. But the part of prostitution that's most dangerous, most problematic, huge numbers of those women had addiction problems, And it's complex relationships. Some of them are addicted and then prostitute themselves. Then they become even more traumatized and they need even more drugs to. So I think that's a gender aspect that needs to be looked at and talked about more.
There is a group in society, I don't know how to approach them. They're like probably highly traumatized. They treat others with violence. And they really think they can have a good life while everybody around them is suffering. So they're so close to other people suffering, and they cannot, they're stuck in their trauma. So how do you approach these people?
Could you tell me a bit more about, could you give me an example? I want to make sure I understand what you mean.
People in control. The powerful people.
Oh, right, okay. So
I see them as being highly traumatized, and how you can actually have a good time feeling good. How can you feel good knowing that other people are suffering, and sometimes even suffering you are making them suffer? How sick are those people, and how can we approach them? We cannot use force. They have more force than we do.
Wow, that's a profound question. I think you're right, and I think, you know, if you read about Donald Trump's childhood, for example, right, like, so his father was this deranged monster, as far as I can tell. You know, they send Donald Trump away when he's like 10 to this horrendous boarding school where he's brutally, where Donald Trump describes being beaten up and like by the staff, and he praises the adults who beat him up when he was a child, and just really awful. And you can just see he's really, I don't mean this as a joke, really mentally disturbed, right? And very unwell. So I think you're right. I think there's two questions, isn't there? There's, in what you're saying, it seems to me, I could be wrong, correct me if I am, there's what can we do about those individuals, and then there's how did we end up with a society where these people are rewarded and given power rather than, you know, seen as very unwell and given care. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. How to stop them doing what they're doing?
Well, I think it's a really massively important question, and I don't feel confident I have the answer. What I do feel is, and it links back to your question right much earlier, I think if you create a society where people's psychological needs are not met, they'll end up showing lots of forms of distress. And some of that will be addiction, and some of that will be suicide and all these problems that are going up. Some of it will just, I think all the time about this woman that I met, I was in Cleveland just before the American presidential election in 2016, with this group of people who were trying to get out the vote to stop Trump, right? And we were on this street in Cleveland where like a third of the houses were demolished, a third were abandoned, and a third still had people living in them. It's this horrendous area, right? There's a woman where we knocked on her door, and we got talking to her, and I thought from talking to her she was 60. I discovered talking to her she was the same age as me. We were talking, she'd had this really hard life. She was quite thoughtful, she was intelligent, she knew quite a lot. There was no way she was going to vote for Hillary Clinton. She was enraged. And she said this thing that really stayed with me. We were talking about she started talking about what her life was like for her parents and her grandparents, right? And they left school when they were 16 and they got good jobs and they had this decent life. And she meant to say when I was young, but what she actually said is when I was alive. And she didn't even notice she'd done it, I don't think. And it really stayed with me. In a way, I think it's easier to think about what we do with people like her than what we do with people like Trump, because it's because of that well of distress that you end up with Trump and Brexit. Now, don't get me wrong, obviously I don't think Trump or Brexit are the solution to her. In fact, I'm sure her life is worse now because of Trump. But I think, to me, the heart of the question is, I don't know what you do with Trump because he's been rewarded for such dysfunctional behaviour for so long that I don't know what you would do at this point with him. A man so weird that he would say he would have sex with his own daughter if she wasn't his daughter. That's someone who's so distorted, and so I don't know what you do with that. But I do think I know what we can do with people like that woman. And it comes back to what you're saying, things like universal basic income, democratising our workplaces so they have more control over their life. There's a whole range of things we can do for them. I think that's easier. A healthier society will not be drawn to sick people in the same way. That bit I think is easier to think about. What we do about Trump as a person, that's beyond my expertise.
Okay.
Sure. She praised my book, so I love her.
Come on, Heather. Okay. She wants to comment on this, and then one last question.
Great.
Okay.
I'm a psychologist, so this is a psychological question.
We have the expert again, right?
Well, if you think about the term psychopathy, which is you have two kinds, kind of. One of them is proposed to be born. You're born with a defect in a little area of the brain that produces empathy, and that has kind of been the view, the normal view that psychopathy can't be treated. So, and there haven't been really many attempts to it. But now, incidentally, from Portugal, there are preliminary results from compassion-focused therapy, and they are showing very remarkable results. It's a small cohort at the moment, but it's happening. Unfortunately, those people are the traumatized individuals that don't have any power in society. But the ones in power, you're not gonna have. They don't have incentive, so you cannot forget them.
I wish we could forget them.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you. And one last question?
My question is more directed to the people who are involved in the Icelandic harm reduction project. Some years ago there was a program or a project going on in Reykjavík which was called Borgarverðir, if I remember right, which was basically like a team of people that you were supposed to be able to call instead of the police if you would see a person who was obviously under influence of some drugs or whatever and needed help, you could call them. And this was seems to be like a really good program because the last thing you want to do is to call the cops or the ambulance because the cops come along. But this was really, it seemed to be not really promoted. And I called it once, and it was actually a friend of mine who answered the phone. And the first thing she said was basically, "How did you know?"
And how did you know?
How did you know that you should call? And it seemed, nobody knew of it. No one I spoke. I just saw it in the news one day, and I remembered it when I saw a person on the street. So I was wondering, was there any result of this program? Was it, and can it continue in some way?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was a pilot project for 1 year, and it was a collaboration between the city and the police. So there was actually a police officer in the car, and social workers, and it ran for 1 year, and it had some results. Most results being that it cleared the city, so people using drugs after out in the open were not anymore in Austurvöllur and places that we the citizens do not want them to be in. So basically, that used to be the aim of the project, to help people get out of the center of the town to more,
When was this? Into the shadows.
into the shadows, help them into the shadows. Yeah. Yeah.
Because if I understood correctly, this was supposed to be some sort of a harm reduction project, and the person that I knew that was involved in it had been working with Ragnar, for example. So
That seems to be so Icelandic though, that you phone the emergency number and it's someone you know. So in fact, Halldór, who's my brilliant translator, was I asked him about Sjön, the writer. How do you say it again? Sean. I said, I really speak very good. And 2 hours later, we bumped into him in the street. I was like, it was like a weird stress stream where you mention someone and then they appear. Can I just say one last thing I forgot to say much earlier, which is, tomorrow we have the launch of my book. I want to just thank again Halldór, who did the translation, which I'm so thrilled about. And he also asked me to mention, I think it's really important. So the story of how it ended up in Iceland, I think is kind of interesting because Halldór and his wife Tada, who's here, were in South America and were learning about the disaster of the drug war there, and then came back to Iceland and realised this is a kind of other battlefield in the drug war, and that these are connected stories. And there's an introduction about Iceland and Icelandic drug policy that's exactly about that. So you're all very welcome to come to the book launch tomorrow. Halda, do you want to say where it is? I can't remember any Icelandic word. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Þetta á morgun í Borgarbókasafninu og þetta byrjar klukkan 2 og stendur til 4. Og það verða
vímuefni á staðnum.
Later. There you go.
Ég sagði ekki gróf. Borgarbókasafninu í grófum, það var bara niður í miðbæ, niður á Akureyri. Og það verður boðið upp á veitingar og ekki neitt áfengi eða neitt slíkt, sko. Við lærum út að svolítið og fannst ekki kannski eiga því því að vera að veita bara eina tegund af vímuefnum. Að við ákváðum bara að hafa gos og mat sem að fyrir marga, fyrir var ég einu svona 135 kíló og mín sko fíkn var mat, þannig að þetta uppið líka var vímuefni. En ég bara vonaði komið og bókin er til sölu og við höfum svona sérstaklega kynninga verð svoleiðis að ég er ekki búinn að biðja Johann ennþá að halda tölu en ég vístu að hann takki því mjög vel að segja hvað hann á fyrir þá sem koma. Takk fyrir.
I wanted to elaborate just in closing on your remark, because I think that the most important thing that you told us was right at the beginning was that harm reduction is hard in the context of prohibition. And the project Borgarverðir, as I understand it, developed into what they made, yes, sure, but the main reason it didn't kind of take off sooner, and the main reason that we haven't a whole integrated system of harm reduction, treatment and prevention is that we are doing all this in the context of prohibition, and that prohibition is in the views of the people who are in the system with us. So we have people that understand harm reduction and want to work by those principles, but we're always in a discourse with people who are coming from the viewpoint of prohibition, and that it really is difficult. And I also wrote down that then we all need to be brave and compassionate and find the niches between, and just not off. I know that I need to ask permission to do stuff, but sometimes you just have to do it. You just have to go and see, is someone going to arrest you and put you into jail for doing something that just makes sense. Harm reduction makes sense to me. You wanted to brief comments?
One last thing. My name is Lilja and I'm the chairman of Snarrótarinnar, and just to, because you talked about this harm reduction in many places, and you talked about drug testing. And I just wanted to let everyone know, because you have the spectrum of use, abuse, and addiction, and Snarrótarinnar does sell test kits for drugs. So if anybody here wants, just contact us, and we have some little type. If anybody has not gotten this, just comment. Yeah, thanks.
Great, amazing.
Thank you, Johann, and thank everyone who took the time to be here with us today on a Friday evening. I'm really impressed.
And you're the people who don't care about football as well. So. Great, thank you.
See you tomorrow.
Great. Cheers. Great.